Welcome, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this installment of the Living on Earth Book Club, The Nutmeg's Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis by Amitav Ghosh. My name is Rebecca Hurst. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston, or SIZZLE. SIZZLE is a research institute focused on keeping historically excluded communities safe and healthy in the face of climate change. And I'm so honored to be here for this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Ghosh. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that UMass Boston is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Massachusetts, as well as recognize their relatives and neighbors, the tribes of the Nutmeg and Wampanoag, and their descendants. We offer a land acknowledgement to acknowledge the historical legacy of colonialism by honoring and paying respect to the land, which was taken by conquest, along with the domination of the people who inhabited the land, and with it, the imposition of white supremacy. We do it to raise greater public consciousness of First Nation sovereignty and cultural rights as a small step toward equitable relationship and reconciliation. This book engages unflinchingly with the legacy of colonialism and extractive capitalism, which we have to do if we're going to create a future where everyone can thrive. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. To get us started, we'll hear some remarks from Professor Sunil Amrit. He is the Renu and Anand Dhawan Professor of History and current chair of the South Asian Studies Council at Yale University. His research focuses on the movements of people and the ecological processes that have connected South and Southeast Asia. Amrit's areas of particular interest include environmental history, the history of migration, and the history of public health. Amrit is the recipient of the 2022 A.H. Heineken Prize for History, a 2017 MacArthur Fellowship, and the 2016 Infosys Prize in Humanities. Now we'll hear from Sunil.
Early on in The Nutmeg's Curse, Amitav Ghosh writes that in a nutmeg, we can see a tiny planet. It's like unearthing a tiny planet. And I think the same could be said of Ghosh's work, because so many worlds live within it. Amitav Ghosh is still probably best known as a novelist, and a novelist of such extraordinary range. From the edge of fantasy and science fiction in the Calcutta Chromosome, to the string of historical novels beginning with The Glass Palace, still probably my favorite of his books, and the Ibis trilogy set in the Indian Ocean world. And then we have the novels embedded in the riverine landscape of his native Bengal. The Shadow Lines, The Hungry Tide, Gun Island, and perhaps less known to an American audience, a recent children's book, Jungle Nama, which my children certainly love, based on the stories, the narratives, the folklore of the Sundarbans. Ghosh is also an anthropologist, author of In an Antique Land, a wonderful mixture of memoir, travelogue, and history. And I sometimes wonder when the environmental turn set in Amitav Ghosh's work. And I think it's been there all along. The landscape is utterly alive in The Hungry Tide, for example. Elephants cut a memorable presence in the Glass Palace, as do the forests of Malaysia and Burma. The Nutmeg's Curse is, I think, the second in a pair of non-fiction works that Ghosh has produced over the last few years. The first was called The Great Derangement, based on his Berlin lectures in Chicago. The Nutmeg's Curse has an urgent sense of now. It was written at the height of the pandemic. It is suffused with a sense of loss, including the personal losses that Amitav suffered during that time and the losses suffered by so many millions of people around the world. It's suffused with a sense of the urgency of a planetary catastrophe. But what's wonderful about the book is that it puts that urgency in dialogue with a deep excavation of multiple histories. In The Humble Nutmeg, Ghosh sees the seeds of our path to planetary crisis. We know well, he says, about the relationship between capitalism and the climate crisis. In Ghosh's works of nonfiction, the relationship between empire and the climate crisis take center stage. And these at times intersect with and at times diverge from the specific relationship of capitalism to environmental crisis. A powerful theme in A Nutmeg's Curse is the entwined nature of the violence against people and against nature, and how an alienation of people from a rich set of relationships with other species and with the rest of nature was fundamental to the project of European colonial domination of the world. Ghosh argues that, amongst other things, what we suffer from is really a failure of the imagination. Non-humans are no longer seen in literary fiction and so much of our popular culture as having agency. And so Ghosh, in The Nutmeg's Curse, takes his cosmopolitan and empathetic reading of a whole range of indigenous and other cultural and imaginative traditions to remind us that non-humans do and must speak. I am so grateful to have Amitav Ghosh as an inspiration, as somebody to think with, and I know you'll all enjoy enormously hearing what he has to say about this brilliant new book.
Well, thank you so much, Sunil. I'm Steve Curwood. I'm the host of Living on Earth, the public radio program and podcast based at the School for the Environment here at the University of Massachusetts. And I want to thank you, Sunil and Rebecca, for joining us, and all of you for joining us for this look into something. This is one of the most amazing books I've encountered in many, many, many moons. And it's not very thick. It's maybe only 250 pages. But spoiler alert, if you get a copy, put it next to the place where you like to read and drink it in one essay at a time, maybe even a half an essay at a time, because I found myself thinking practically at the end of every paragraph. But before we start, I have to remind you that we can't do this without your help. So if you can, please consider sending us a donation by going to loe.org and clicking on donate at the top of the page. And tonight, we have the honor of being able to offer 20 copies of The Nutmeg's Curse, half of which were very generously donated by the publisher, the University of Chicago Press, to give away to the first 20 people who donate $65 or more. And you can do that at loe.org. Just click on donate at the top of the page. I think Sunil really said it, how huge the scope of this book is. It essentially is a handbook to where the heck we are right now on this planet. Now, it doesn't go back thousands of years. It only has to go back about 500 years to talk about this, where we have wound up. And I suspect that reading this book will change the way that you see the world and many of the things that you learn from now on. So I am so happy to have the author himself here today from Brooklyn, USA. Amitav Ghosh, welcome to Living on Earth.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for those very generous comments. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And it's our pleasure, certainly, to have you. So let's cut to the chase. Why did you write this book?
Well, that's a difficult one to answer. Well, many of these thoughts had been in my head for a long, long time. But, and I was planning to finally get to them. And then, the pandemic struck. And I literally started writing this book in March. I think I started writing the book around about the 10th of March. So I just wrote and wrote and wrote through the entire pandemic. And I think that did generate a tremendous sense of urgency, as Sunil said in his very generous introduction. I've never written a book at this pace before. It usually takes me years. But this one, essentially, I wrote the whole book in 8 months.
Wow. So let's go actually to the beginning of this book. Tell us about the Bandanese genocide in, I believe it's 1621. Tell us why this is such a pivotal point in our history.
Well, it's just a sort of, if you like, one instance of what was happening in so many places. So this is what happened. the nutmeg tree, is endemic to the area around the Banda Islands. And nutmegs have been traded across the planet, well, at least across Eurasia and Africa for thousands of years. It was immensely valued. It was almost, you might say, the original commodity. And so what happened is that roundabout, in the 15th and 16th centuries, the nutmeg became enormously valuable along with several other spices. But by weight, nutmegs and cloves were the most valuable, and they were both from the Spice Islands. So this is one of this was the impetus behind the great voyages of so-called exploration or discovery, if you like, that that brought European voyagers to the United States, but they were looking to America. What am I saying? But they were looking, of course, for the Spice Islands, and eventually, after Vasco da Gama found the route to the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese ended up in the Moluccas, and they made their way straight, to the islands of the clove and the islands of the nutmeg. But the Portuguese were displaced as the world's most important maritime power in the 17th century, and the Dutch took over. And the Dutch were particularly intent on seizing the trade in nutmegs. They wanted a monopoly over the entire nutmeg trade. So they tried to force these treaties and contracts on the people of the Banda Islands, and there weren't so many people there. There were only about 15,000. But the people resisted, obviously. I mean, you're going to resist giving away something that's been in your family for thousands of years. So they resisted. And in 1621, the Dutch Governor General of the East Indies, a man called Jan Pietersen Koen, actually took a fleet to the Banda Islands. And essentially, in a period of like 10 weeks, he and his troops completely eliminated the Bandanese. They killed many thousand. They drove many thousands into the mountains where they starved. And they enslaved thousands. And a few hundred managed to escape. But essentially, the entire island was depopulated in about 10 weeks. So, but we have to remember that the Banda Islands are one edge of the Dutch Empire. The other edge of the Dutch Empire was where you are sitting and where I'm sitting. This was New Amsterdam and it was New Holland. Brooklyn was Breukelen, And here too, essentially the same thing was going on, except that it was the English more than the Dutch who were exterminating Native Americans, as Rebecca pointed out in her in her land acknowledgement. And so the elimination of the Bandanese was almost synchronous with the elimination of the Pequot from Connecticut. So I think it was really the sort of incredible violence that was unleashed upon the Americas that made it possible for the Dutch to think of actually exterminating the entire population of the Banda Islands in order to seize really the product of the nutmeg tree.
You use the word exploration. I think you mean exploitation, really. So what are the origins then of what you call the nutmeg's curse, this whole resource curse mentality that, yes, the Dutch take it east to the Spice Islands and west to the Americas, although they're getting jostled by the Brits, as you say. What's going on here? And let me ask you a question based on one of the most well, there's so many interesting parts of your book, but one of the most surprising to me was you also talk about the evolution of witchcraft in these times.
Yes.
Yes. So what does witchcraft have to do with colonial exploitation?
Well, it's a very complicated set of connections. My friend, the writer Howard French, who's just published a book called Born in Blackness, would argue that actually these processes started even before the onslaught on the Americas and the Indian Ocean. It started off Africa, and especially Western Africa, the Canary Islands, where the Portuguese invent this model of plantation economy. And that's the model that they carry, plantation economy, essentially with manpower provided by enslaved people. So he argues that, in fact, it's the extension of this economy that ultimately bring the Portuguese, both to the Portuguese and the Spanish, both to the Americas as well as to the Indian Ocean. So it's a complicated genealogy of how this economy arises, and of course, in the Canary Islands, it was the commodity in question was sugar and sugarcane, and there again it was very similar. The native people were exterminated, and these massive plantations were created. The connection with witchcraft, I think, is also a very strange, complex matter. Because what happens, before the 17th century, before the discovery of the Americas, really, people everywhere saw the world in a certain way, which was that humans weren't the only people with souls. The only beings with souls. All sorts of beings had souls. So it was very common, for example, even within Europe, for people to imagine that they were taking nighttime journeys, for them to have visions, for them to have all sorts of complex relationships with animals, with trees, with sacred landscapes, and so on. But what happened when the Europeans conquered the Americas is that they were able to think of themselves as the masters, the sole masters of everything on earth. They were the only beings with agency. Everything else was mute. Because the scale of the violence that they unleashed in the Americas is something without precedent in human history, I know poor old Genghis Khan always gets called out for being such a terrible, so terribly violent and cruel. But, Genghis Khan never went and exterminated civilizations or, basically extinguished entire civilizations. Whereas this is what the Europeans were doing in the Americas, most of all. So I think it's at this point that this small group of elite European men, who also create the philosophies of the Enlightenment, that they create this idea that any notion of other than human beings having souls or having agency or having historical potential is a kind of witchcraft, that it's a pact with the devil. That's how it becomes. That's how this whole idea of witchcraft arises, because witchcraft is seen. Really, that's exactly the conception of witchcraft, that witches are people who commune with the devil and who see forms of agency in nature. So that's what I would say, that, this is the sort of strange connection that you have between colonial violence, philosophies, and the unleashing of these massive extermination campaigns against poor European peasants.
It's so shocking, of course, the mass murder, the massacres that occurred. The one that you start with, of course, with the Bandanese, but then in the Americas. And that's why I asked you about witchcraft, because what would motivate people to decide to kill everybody? Men, women, children, burn down the places that they live to make way for themselves. I mean, throughout human history, obviously people have fought wars and squabbled. Usually, as you point out in your book, it's a classic war is the warriors go out and they duke it out. But in this case, the Europeans, this particular set of Europeans, just decided to put a metaphorical torch to every living human in their path. Witchcraft is perhaps one explanation you offer in the book. Are there others that you what leads to this kind of thinking?
It was a level of violence that's literally kind of inconceivable. But we also have to remember that this violence was also occurring within Europe during these 30 years war, the wars of religion in Northern Europe. There again, men, women, children were often slaughtered on a mass scale. So this violence was a kind of cycle, which was going back and forth between Europe and the Americas. And at the same time, these same Europeans who are colonizing America are also enslaving millions and millions of Africans. So if you just think of the enormity of this project, at the same time, they're completely depopulating two massive continents, and they're repopulating them with enslaved people from another continent. I mean, it's just mind-boggling if you think about it, So this starts, of course, with the grab for the most important resource of all, which is land. And that's what the Native American populations had, and that's what the European colonists wanted. And if you look at the whole history of the Indian War, so-called Indian Wars, which starts in the 16th century and goes onwards, the savagery is just unbelievable, I mean, the way that the settlers fall upon Native American communities and just wipe them all out, and not just wipe them out, also wipe out all possibility of their livelihood by deforesting the land, by damming rivers and so on, by creating all these environmental changes. So, that carries on until really the 19th and even the 20th centuries, early 20th centuries. So it's a level of violence which is kind of astonishing to think. And yet at the same time, these wars are not really thought of as war in the classic European sense, when armies fight each other. So, throughout American history, really, the wars against Native Americans were described in very many different ways. Dirty wars, wars of settlement or something, but they were considered conceptually distinct from the sorts of wars that Europeans fought with each other. So there were no rules in this war at all.
Yeah, I was going to say the Europeans sort of had, quote, honor, close quotes, let me put air quotes around that word, honor, when they had their wars. Nothing like that when it came to clearing the land of Bond-Denise or the first people here in America. There was some value in scooping the people off of the continent of Africa to be sold. So I guess there was some transactional value there. But so how do nature and ecosystems fit in to this value set of these Europeans? If witchcraft said that there were witches if they were talking to the other creatures or the rocks or anything, then it only was important to talk to people. What worth was nature and the ecosystem?
So that's the interesting thing. As I said before, peasants, indigenous people, farmers around the world historically did not see animals and trees and forests and other beings generally as completely separate from themselves. They saw all these kinds of beings as being within some sort of continuity. And I think this is still substantially the case in most parts of the world. It's certainly the case for Indian peasants today. It's the case with Indonesian farmers, also with many European farmers. They continue to think of the world in that way. But when the colonists arrived around the 17th century, one of the sort of things that happens with this Enlightenment philosophy is that you have the body and soul completely distinguished. The body belongs to nature, the soul belongs somewhere else. And this becomes transposed onto the nature-culture difference. So, the social, what is human, is thought of as being completely different from the natural. So, when these terrible calamities overtake the Native Americans, colonists would say, oh, that's not us, that's nature. When, for example, they would destroy the forest, and the animals leave with the forest, they say, well, it's not ours, it's just nature. Similarly, with the spread of disease, they would say, oh, these are diseases just spreading, even though they're actively abetting the spread of disease in many different ways. I mean, most of all, disease tends to spread very quickly in populations that are traumatized and dispossessed. And that's what was happening anyway with Native Americans. And, for example, with the Bandanese and so on. So, this distinction between what is natural and what is social or cultural becomes actually an element in this war that they're waging against actual people. They're just able to sort of shrug and say, oh, well, that's not our fault. It's just nature doing stuff. And I think you see this reproduced often in today's climate denialism, where again, a lot of people, the denialists will always argue, oh, well, nature is doing this, climate is variable, it has always changed, so it's not our fault, it's just nature doing its thing. So in so many ways, we see the legacy of these modes of thinking and the legacy of this time coming back to haunt us now.
At one point in your book, you talk about the relationship between wars and trade. And I believe you quote someone saying that it goes both ways. If you have trade, you're going to get wars, and if you have wars, you're going to get trade. Obviously, this is a prelude to saying more about fossil fuels, but drill down on this point for me, if you would, for a moment.
Well, it seems surprising to us today because for like 100 years, we've been sort of raised with this idea that, trade and war are two separate things, and that where there's trade, there will be no war, that sort of thing. But it's completely without foundation. The person I quoted was exactly the Governor General who eliminated the Bandanese, Jan Peterson Koen, and he said his famous saying was, "No trade without war, no war without trade." I mean, basically, the Dutch went to war in these ways because they wanted to control trade. And there was an absolutely fundamental relationship between war and trade. And, if we just sort of peel away these sort of rose-tinted glasses that have been put on us, we can see that the relationship between war and trade remains absolutely fundamental to this day. These endless wars that we have in the middle, we've seen in the Middle East, the war that we are seeing in Europe today. One of the first weapons that was used was exactly sanctions. That is, cutting off trade.
And I think Louis, our producer, suggested that many readers may not have considered before reading this book is how stopping fossil fuel burning isn't simply a matter of the logistics, the mechanics, if you will, of replacing oil with renewables. How does the narrative and culture around fossil fuels, which are so intensely traded, right? How does this make this a much more complicated issue?
Well, it's complicated in so many ways. It's technologically complicated to get away from it. But the bits that I talk about in the book are the geopolitical aspects of fossil fuels. One of the most important geopolitical aspects of fossil fuels is the petrodollar. In order to buy oil for the last 70 years or so, the last 50 years or so, any country had to buy dollars first. And this became one of the pillars of the American economy and continues to be so even today. And, the US elite over innumerable changes of administration have shown very clearly that they will defend the petrodollar at all costs. Saddam Hussein, one of the things that he did that really riled the US foreign policy elite was he started trading oil without petrodollars. Again, that happened in Venezuela. So, but what we also do see today is really that a lot more and more oil is being traded without the petrodollar. And this is clearly one of the very big concerns for the US going forward. The other essential geopolitical element in this is that one of the characteristics of oil is that it has to flow. It has to be taken from one place to another. And this in itself creates a certain geopolitical dynamic, because you can shut off a country from getting supplies of oil. So there are like 4 or 5 choke points, most of them in the Indian Ocean. There's the Straits of Hormuz, through which 40% of the world's oil is traded. If you can shut off the Straits of Hormuz, then really you can deny all your adversaries oil. Similarly, the Straits of Malacca. So it's in this way that oil plays a very, very important part in strategic considerations geopolitically. And historically, the Anglo-American empire has relied on the flow of fossil fuels in order to bolster its power. So an enormous amount of American military resources are actually devoted not so much to bringing oil to the United States, because you don't have to do that anymore. The United States is more or less self-sufficient in fossil fuels. But what is important here is not that the U.S. have its supplies of oil interrupted. What is important is that the U.S. should be able to cut off supplies of oil to any adversaries. So, in essence, this is fundamentally the geopolitical dynamic of the last 100 years, almost, you might say, and that's why so many U.S. resources are devoted to controlling the choke points of the Indian Ocean.
So, one of the points that you make around this issue of having power by controlling fossil fuels is that to end the use of fossil fuels might just end the hegemony of the global North. How possible is that geopolitical shift, do you think?
I think we are seeing it all around us. And I don't think that we'll be able to move away completely from fossil fuels for a very long time. Certainly, the military uses of fossil fuels will continue for a very long time. But I do think that we are seeing a major, major shift away. I mean, everybody knows this. There's some sort of energy transition happening on a very large scale. And I don't think that it's an accident that this energy transition is being led by China. China now has enormous investments. It more or less controls the solar panel market globally. It's invested very heavily. I think its investments in alternative energy is like 3 times or 4 times that of the United States. Anyway, it's many multiples of what the United States has invested. And I think the reason behind this is not because China is so concerned about the environment. I think it's also because there is a major geopolitical. It has a major geopolitical interest. If China can massively diminish its use of fossil fuels, it will be relatively free of being dependent on these geopolitical choke points, like most of all the Straits of Malacca.
That's right. China, of course, has some coal at home. It imports some, but I believe it has to import virtually all of its oil, or much of its oil, and they're huge oil consumers. Only maybe behind the United States. But let me ask you a little bit more about the militarization that you write about here. Talk to me about why, if I've read you correctly here, why you see the military as such a primary driver of the resource curse as the protector of global oil extraction and transport. I mean, and here's the question. As we phase out fossil fuels, what is the U.S. going to do with our multi-trillion dollar so-called defense industry, military? We have such huge resources in that.
It's very hard to see, really. I mean, well, let me put it like this. Firstly, we don't really know exactly how much of global greenhouse gas emissions comes from military activity. I think there's no completely accurate estimate. One estimate is that it's like 20 to 25% of the US's greenhouse gas emissions comes from military uses. The Pentagon is the single largest consumer of fossil fuels in the whole world, you know. But I think this is actually a massive underestimate because, we are not taking into account the fossil fuels that are used in the production of weaponry. We are not taking into account, research, all those infrastructures that exist in order to create weaponry. So if all that is taken into account, I don't know. I think military activities of one kind or another, and this is not true not just of the US, but also of Russia, China, India, etc., probably accounts for, more than 25% of most national greenhouse gas emissions. But the really weird thing is that these greenhouse gas emissions are never taken into account in international negotiations because the US pushed through an agreement during the writing of the Kyoto Accord, which excluded military emissions from all negotiations. So, you can see already that if a quarter of the emissions are just, excluded, and also excluded, for example, shipping emissions, air transport emissions, then really, what are we talking about anyway?
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's the power of your book here, because you talk about things that people don't really want to talk about. Rebecca kindly invoked the land that was stolen from the native peoples here. There may be some way to do some reparations along those lines, but the lives that have been lost in this pursuit of power in this fashion cannot be brought back. Yet we have this huge military-industrial complex that, has a lot of characteristics of the extermination of the Native Americans here. I mean, the United States is, shamefully, 200,000 people we killed in a single day in Hiroshima? Another 75,000 people in Nagasaki? We're the only nation that's done that. And we have this large military machine, which is so dependent on fossil fuels. So let me ask you, again, in a slightly different way, if our society is successful in reducing the use of fossil fuels to a relatively trivial amount, to what extent might that demilitarize this country and others around the world? Or help demilitarize?
I would say, Steve, that your guess is as good as mine, but I don't see.
Okay. Oh, my goodness. Power does what power wants. Now you say things are shifting, though, and you're looking at this geopolitical order. How important is the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, which is a big step towards decarbonization? How is that happening, as it seems to be so antithetical to the fossil fuel interest in the U.S. and around the world that you write about, and correctly, I would say, really are running much of this game, much of the whole worldwide power game?
The IRA is a very interesting. It's a very interesting issue. It's a very complicated issue. In the first place, let me say I'm very glad that it did get passed, and I'm glad that it's been sort of a point of hope for many young activists and so on. So I'm really glad it came about, and I hope it will lead to to hastening the energy transition in the United States. But again, as I said, I do think that there are very complicated factors behind it. Now we see that the Europeans are absolutely enraged about the IRA because they feel that what the IRA is essentially doing is erecting huge tariff barriers against European industry, and they see it as really stealing European industry and forcing European industry to relocate to the United States. So already there you can see it has certain geopolitical implications. But beyond that, I would also say that the IRA might make a difference to the United States, but at this moment in time, the United States is not the most important player in relation to global greenhouse gas emissions. China, India, Indonesia, Africa, that's where the real struggle lies. And, the IRA is not going to make any difference in relation to those parts of the world. It's an unfortunate thing that a lot of the discourse around climate change and the mitigation of climate change and so on tends to be very, very Eurocentric, very, very centered on the West, particularly on the United States. But you have to remember that the problem is not located here, and it can't be solved here as such.
Because, well, of course, the argument is that historically the U.S. is the most responsible for the CO2 that we have. But you're saying that that is in the past, and the present is really what's happening in China, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it's, that's really the issue, the U.S. isn't just the biggest historical emitter. The U.S. also pioneered this particular extractive model of capitalism, And then after 1990, with the Washington Consensus, it basically pushed this model down the throats of every part of the world. And now it's achieved its own momentum. It's very hard to see that, countries elsewhere are going to sort of scale back, unless the United States also leads the way in that. And unfortunately, something like the IRA leads you to think that the solutions can be purely technological. And I don't think they can. I think we have to really think of a different approach where we start rethinking the ways that we live. And that's one of the great tragedies, because you're talking about the Native American lives that have been lost, the land that has been lost, but also what has been lost is Native American philosophies, Native American wisdom, certain ways of relating to the land, which we are now having to resort to in desperation, because it's clear that in so many ways Native Americans understood the land better than contemporary Americans, than white Americans did, So,
yeah, you see. I'm sorry.
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Just one of your main points is that we have to go to what you call a more vitalist approach instead of a mechanistic approach, and really do see. And one of my favorite images here that water is not just water, but there is an essence that's contained in water. I say that as an example.
Steve, I'm afraid you just froze for a minute there. So if you could just repeat what you were saying.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Uh-oh. Yeah, I don't know sorry about this. What I was saying is that one of the main points of your book is that we need to take a vitalist approach that respects that non-human beings have value, and that they don't simply need to be a resource or something that needs to be tamed, but in fact, native and Aboriginal cultures, of course, have done this since time immemorial and can show us the way. I don't know how much of that you got to hear.
Yes, I think I heard it all. Yes, absolutely. I do think that is the case. But I also do think that it's happening, you know. Across America now, there are all these various earth-centered movements of various kinds, no matter whether you're speaking of a New Age stuff or of activist movements like the No Dakota Pipeline movement. All of these are earth-centered movements, and I think these movements are spreading across the world, and they're, you know, they offer us some cause for hope.
And of course, one of the features of original story, what's Native American, Aboriginal, Indigenous, whatever you want to call it, is storytelling. And you're a storyteller.
Yes.
What's the power of storytelling that can help us through this exceedingly fraught moment that you have described in your, quote, parables for a planet in crisis? Close quote.
You know, as you say, I'm a storyteller. So I have to think about the power of stories. It's kind of my job. But I wouldn't claim too much for storytelling, you know. I know that many scientists and so on seem to think that stories are the solution and storytelling is one of the ways in which the problem could be solved. But I think they're being too optimistic, you know. I think, you know, billionaires, technocrats, they have such a powerful hold upon the world that storytelling is a very slender reed with which to resist, you know, the direction in which they're pushing us.
So what's the solution then?
I don't like to think of a solution. I don't know if there is a single solution. I can only address the solutions the problems that I see in my own work, you know, in my own field, in my field of storytelling. And that's really become, you know, for me, the great challenge. I mean, how do I change my forms of storytelling? How do I tell different stories? Whether the stories will have an actual effect upon the real world, I don't know. But I would want to do that work anyway.
We have a question here. Can you comment on the role of religion in fueling hatred and violence? The teachings of Jesus, the Prophet Muhammad, and others have so often been twisted by other people to justify oppression and even extermination of people seen as the other. We even see this, of course, happening within religions. You know, the Catholics versus the Protestants, the Sunni versus the Shia. How can we reclaim religion as a force for good?
Let's not forget that, you know, it's not just religion that has you know, propagated these terrible ideas. Science has done so as well. I mean, you know, eugenics and so on played a very large part in the ideology of Nazism. So I don't think we can actually exempt any set of ideas just because they are so-called religion or so-called science. I think we have to examine in each particular case what the ideas are that are being offered. You know, a large part of the exterminations that were happening in the 19th century had behind them a certain kind of social Darwinism, which came, you know, came completely from a certain eugenicist point of view. And, you know, in the United States, eugenicism was a very powerful idea, well, you know, into the 1940s, and it's still with us in many ways. We see it manifesting itself now in these neo-Nazi movements and eco-fascist movements. So, you know, I don't think we can just say that, you know, only religion has had these ideas. So I think we have to be more discriminating in our approach to each of these ideological complexes.
We have a bit of time. It would be great to hear you share something about the connection the Bandan people had with the nutmeg, and uh, and the songs, the poems they had about it as well.
Well, for the Bandans, the nutmeg was much more, you know, the nutmeg was an object of commerce, that made them rich and prosperous. And, they were skilled traders. They went around the Indian Ocean trading. They had very extensive trade relations. But at the same time, the Bandans were also very skilled gardeners because the nutmeg tree is not easy to grow. And when the Dutch first tried to grow nutmegs on their own, they had no success at all. They had to bring Bandans back as slaves to, to teach them how to grow the nutmeg. I mean, that's one of the most ghastly aspects of this story, that these people, had been forcibly torn from their land and then brought back to advise the Dutch on how to grow nutmegs. So, the Bandans were traders, they were gardeners, and for them, the nutmeg tree figured in all these practices. But the nutmeg was also, a being that figured in their storytelling, in their songs. And fortunately, because several hundred Bandanese did manage to escape and take refuge elsewhere, their stories and songs have been preserved. And to this day, the Bandanese annually go back to their islands to remember the genocide, and also to remember their ancestral connections with the land.
So you have detailed exquisitely, with sharp insight and brilliant prose, how we got ourselves into this mess. What gives you hope?
Well, I think if you look at the COVID pandemic, it offers us certain sorts of pointers to both the terrible nightmare, the nightmares that perhaps await us in the future. But it also showed us that, even as our worlds were shutting down, even as our worlds were growing narrower, we found other things to give life meaning. People discovered the value of having family and friends. People discovered what was really important to them. People discovered that, terrible drone-like jobs weren't really what they wanted to do. They changed their ways of living. And I think those are all good things. And I think in the future, as we go ahead, there'll be more and more occasion for us to choose, those things that are important for us, like, again, human connections, family, friends, community, rather than consumerism. Just buying clothes for the sake of it, or buying other stuff for the sake of it. And I think that's certainly something that we can take some hope from.
I mean, how can we move towards global cooperation and respect in the future?
I think the only way, really, is for, the countries that are already rich, like the United States, like Europe, for them to start very seriously considering major changes in their lifestyles, ways of shrinking their carbon footprint. Because until they do that, until rich countries do that, the global south is not going to do it. If you go to anybody, anywhere in the global south, I mean, say, when I was in the Malaccas, one part of the Malaccas is actually very badly hit by climate change. And the clove trees that used to grow there are now increasingly threatened. And I spoke to the farmers and I said, given the fact that your livelihood is now so seriously threatened, don't you think you should shrink your carbon footprint? And their answer was exactly the same thing that I've heard everywhere in Asia, which is they will say, why should we shrink our carbon footprint? They over there got rich when we were weak. And, they became rich and affluent. Now it's our turn, you know. So, the only way, really, that there can be a respectful and mutually effective way of changing these things is really, I think, the global north has to take the lead in cutting back, in shrinking its lifestyles, in shrinking its carbon footprints. And frankly, do I see that happening? No, I don't see that happening.
Wow, I thought we were taught to share in nursery school. Did we forget it all?
Were we taught to share? I think what we were taught really is what an entire generation of kids has been taught is greed is good.
And more is better.
Yes.
Well, we have the clock is relentless here, and I'd love to go on, but we have to start to draw this to a close here. Let me say first of all that it has been such an honor to have you here at the Living on Earth Book Club, and I also, of course, want to thank our fellow presentation partners, the UMass Boston School for the Environment and the Sustainable Solutions Lab, and we'll hear from Rebecca again in just a moment. But let me remind you all that we will be sending copies of the Nutmeg's Curse to the first 20 people who donate $65 or more. It looks like this. See? This is it. It's great. And the subtitle of it, though, is Parables for a Nation in Crisis. So, as our guest has said, he has some wonderful ideas and suggestions about the direction to go, but it's up to us collectively to really develop these prescriptions based on the parables that have been presented here. But if you enjoyed tonight's event, please send us $65 or any and you want to see more events like this, please help us do this. So it's loe.org, or there'll be a survey that'll pop up in a moment. But now let me turn to Rebecca and ask her to make a few more remarks before we wrap up for the evening.
Great. Thank you so much, Amitav. Thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for joining us. As Steve said, this was a really powerful conversation, and the book is as well, and really pushing us to think differently about how did we get into this mess, and what are the different things we can be thinking about as we're moving forward. So thank you so much to our fellow presentation partners, the Living on Earth Book Club and the UMass Boston School for the Environment. And as Steve said, feel free to support Living on Earth and get your own copy of the Nutmeg's Curse. And thank you all so much for joining us, and have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a great pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for
Our
taking the
pleasure.
time with us.
Thank you.
Pleasure.